Hello, my name is Brock Bergseth. I'm a research fellow at James Cook University, and I'm here to speak to you today about a bit of work that I did. In brief, my specialty is really bringing human behavioral sciences and social sciences to conservation problems like those that you face in the field as rangers. So what I'm going to tell you about today is a bit of work that we did, which was really trying to understand what the challenges that rangers face are, what kind of threats they see to conservation and from conservation, and really kind of some of these other operational issues that might be faced during work. We focused on world regions where less is known and where data was rare. And we looked at 3 study countries where we had enough replication to really dig into the data, and those were Colombia, Indonesia, and Pakistan. So as far as the methodology goes, we used what we call a snowball sampling methodology, along with some key contacts from the International Ranger Federation. In this case, we would ask people whether they wanted to fill out an online survey via Google Forms, and then to recommend other people at the end of the survey if they enjoyed it and could think of other people that might be of interest for us. In general, this took about 12 minutes overall. And as I said, these were administered via Google Forms for the most part. We had 3 real key focal themes that we focused on. Those were the challenges that rangers face during work, threats to conservation, and then threats to indigenous and local communities from conservation. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the key results here. Now, when it came to challenges faced during work as a ranger, we asked about 8 different types of challenges, whether they're a lack of adequate equipment, adequate training, a lack of personnel or park rangers, all the way through to issues around safety, whether it's due to operating in natural environments or the presence of violent actors. And what we found was that safety due to the presence of violent actors was actually a major challenge in all 3 countries. In Pakistan, numerous respondents spoke about terrorism and the history of conflict and armed conflict that has been occurring in some of those autonomous or semi-autonomous regions. Whereas in Colombia, respondents spoke a lot about kind of the narco conflict or the conflict that occurs because of the history of the drug wars that occurred there. Now, lack of capacity was a major challenge in every country. In Colombia, it was really seen as a lack of rangers, whereas in Indonesia, it was both a lack of rangers and training. And then finally, in Pakistan, it was a lack of rangers, training, and most importantly, equipment that was seen as the largest or major challenge that they faced. Now, when it came to threats to conservation, we asked rangers again to tell us their perception of the severity of these different threats. And we asked about 7 threats here, which you can see, which were agricultural activities, climate change, extractive industries, all the way down to species exploitation and urbanization. And what we found that overall, in Colombia, the most severe threat that was perceived by respondents was that of climate change. And the least severe threat was species exploitation or urbanization. In Indonesia, on the other hand, the most severe threats that were perceived by respondents were species exploitation and extractive industries, whereas urbanization was seen as the least severe. In Pakistan, 5 of the 7 threats that we asked about were seen as severe by our respondents, except for agricultural activities and urbanization. And then when we went one step further to ask about threats to indigenous and local communities from conservation actors or actions, rangers spoke a bit about these different types of threats that they saw, whether it was conflict, potential conflict with conservation authorities, cultural and social disruption, human-wildlife conflict, or a loss of access to resources or restriction on resource use. And what we found was overall, these threats from conservation were actually perceived to be less severe than the threats to conservation actions. And the exception to this was human-wildlife conflict, which was perceived to be quite severe in both Indonesia and Pakistan. Now, I'm going to just quickly put an asterisk next to this finding, and I'll come back to it later before I move on to Colombia. But in Colombia, a loss of access to resources was seen as a significant risk, whereas all other threats tended to be perceived as a moderate risk. Now, when it comes to Colombia, we had a few points of interest. Half of our study population was female, so in this case, it was quite a good gender representation. The most common level of education was postgraduate, followed by undergraduate degrees. And again, as I said earlier, climate change was seen as the most severe threat that they faced. The biggest challenge was violent conflict, as well as a lack of ranger personnel. Now, when it came to Indonesia, all of our respondents were male. Our most common level of education was undergraduate, and species exploitation and extractive industries were seen as the most severe threats. And this likely reflects this heavy economic reliance on natural resources in Indonesia. The biggest challenge in Indonesia, again, was violent conflict and also a lack of adequate equipment and personnel. Now, when it came to Pakistan, more than 90% of our respondents were male, but more than 3/4 had actually completed postgraduate degrees. Again, as I said earlier, most of the threats were perceived to be severe to conservation, especially climate change and species exploitation. When it comes to threats to indigenous and local communities, human-wildlife conflict was seen as the most severe and prevalent, whereas the biggest challenge was generally just a lack of adequate equipment. Now, to tie things up, I want to come back to this overall finding that we had, which was that respondents tended to perceive threats from conservation to be less severe than threats to conservation. And the problem here is that it's overlooking quite a substantial amount of impact that we are now currently seeing in leading research papers that look really at what the effects of conservation are on local communities. And they're much higher than we normally would expect, mostly because people haven't been looking for these issues. And to my eyes, this likely reflects kind of some of the trends that are occurring in ongoing conversations. They also reflect people's shared experiences and also likely reflect the potential focus of rangers, where rangers are trained in more of the biological or the ecological side of things rather than the social sciences. And to me, this really does represent an area for significant growth in training and for more recognition of the threats that conservation may provide, such as threats to human rights or threats to equitable access to resources. And so as I wrap up this presentation, I want to thank you all for listening. And again, emphasize the importance of acknowledging some of the hidden risks that conservation may pose as we are going about our day doing our general conservation work. And so with that, I'll thank you very much for listening to this presentation and close here. Thanks again.